So in that order, we have our first TED-style talk, which is David Davis here from your left variety.
Melton and Rutland. Melton and Rutland.
Yes, Melton and Rutland. Right, okay.
The Far East, as they say in these parts. Right.
So I'll hand over to you.
Say that, well, you might not feel that way at the end. Yes, apart from being a member of the party in Melton and Rutland, which I know is the main focus of what we're doing today, I've also taken on the role, I think probably because I was the last last potential volunteer standing, as convener of the Green Party Nationally's Food and Agriculture Working Group. And because Brexit and all to do with Brexit is, a European funding is a big kind of determinant of the way that food and agriculture policy happens. We're in the process of revising and completely rewriting the party's food and agriculture policy. And there are a couple of other observations on the existing policy, and I think it's interesting in terms of, as a reflection of how the party makes policy and so on, is that actually current policy runs over about 23 pages, some of which are in the food and agriculture section, some of which are in the Europe section, some of which are in the animal welfare section, and all kinds of, and that sort of thing. And the policy is actually really quite repetitive because little bits have been added by accretion over the years as an issue has arisen. Then somebody has kind of passed a policy motion that's included all the implications of that, which were actually included in the previous policy as well. So certain things are simply, stated more than one time, and so on. So we're in the process of trying to review. And I thought, well, it would be useful now to kind of, from a kind of county perspective, view, get other people's views on what ought to go into this policy, rather than those who are simply kind of turn up at the conference and fail to kind of get out of the way when people ask for volunteers. And I think, what are the issues, I suppose, around food and agriculture policy to start with? Because, clearly we need to provide good, nutritious food for the UK population. That's, in a sense, should be the core of the policy. But there's been a whole series, and there's been reports in the press, and these are all kind of evidence, and if people are interested, I can tell you where it's reported properly. Huge decline in the insect population. I think one German study found about a 76% decline in the insect population on nature reserves. There's been stuff in the press over the last week or so about mayflies and river pollution and that kind of thing, and the river pollution largely comes from phosphates draining from farmers' fields and so on. Farmland birds have declined by 50% since 1970. Soil depletion, and according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, possibly only 60 years of farming left, because the soil's getting kind of blown away and washed into the sea and so on. Water resources and rivers and that kind of thing. There's atrophy and green algae growing and so on. Climate change, which is kind of provoking a big change in the way that the landscape actually looks, because rainfall patterns are changing all over the world and that kind of thing. And also, we've got a health crisis, which is very significantly includes diseases caused by diet. And I think there's kind of chronic diseases from kind of poor diet and all sorts of things like that, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease and so on. So basically, our current system is growing the wrong things and growing them in the wrong way, I think is the sort of short conclusion of that. And I think looking at the kind of post-Brexit options that are available, I think there's different perspectives and different views, and I've probably not explained it very well in this little kind of box arrangement, but that there seem to be kind of two sort of lines of division, really. One is those who say the UK ought, as far as possible, to grow as much as possible of its food in the UK, and to get as close to self-sufficiency as possible. And the other is that, oh no, we can just go out on the world market and actually, why not let the Africans go all have our food because they've got more land and they can do it cheaper, and we can buy cheaper food on the world market than we can get it from farmers in the UK. And then there's a second divide along all of that, which is there are some who say we need to use GM and chemicals and all sorts of things in order to increase yields, in order to get to the extra food. And those who say, actually, we're damaging the planet by the present way we're doing things. We need to use kind of more agroecological. And I use that as a kind of broad terms, not as a specific term that I know Coventry University would use. And I suppose in terms of understanding the political dynamics of all of these different options, certainly the NFU is very much on, we want as much homegrown as possible and we will use chemicals and GM and whatever else it takes. So, in a sense, the established farming lobby. There are some, and I suppose of whom Liam Fox is probably the most prominent spokesperson, who says, actually, we can do better on the world market. You know, let's just get a trade deal with the US, get their cheap chicken and beef and all of that kind of thing. And, you know, if the UK ends up as, well, as nature reserves and that kind of thing, well, that's the way of the world. So very much the kind of free market view. And then there's the sort of grow it at home, but kind of let's actually look after the landscape and look after the environment while we're doing it. And there's a large range of organisations that are pretty much in that ballpark. They don't all agree with one another about everything, but essentially there's people like, I suppose, Garden Organic, the Land Workers Alliance, a group called Sustain, which is a coalition of groups that do campaign on food and farming, Permaculture Association, the you know, I can probably think of lots of others, Greener UK, and so on and so forth. But anyway, in terms of the current situation, the other thing about farming in someone in the UK is that there's 70, I realise there's difference between my first two bullet points, but basically there's about 17.4 million hectares in the UK, and I think it's about 14 million in England, something like that. And of that, you know, of that 14 million hectares that receives agricultural subsidy, about 74% of the land is farmed by only 18% of the farmers. So there's a big kind of concentration in terms of land. And I think when you bear in mind that farms below 5 hectares don't qualify for EU subsidy anyway, you know, small horticultural enterprises won't be included in that. So that's actually a bit even bigger imbalance. Now, currently the UK gets about £3.9 billion a year in agricultural support through the Common Agricultural Policy. About 3 billion of that goes in direct payments. That is, you know, if you've got so much agricultural land, you get so much per acre, basically, and you just get a kind of direct sub for holding agricultural land. And some of the big landowners, James Dicel, I suppose, is one kind of example, but anybody who knows East Leicestershire, my target in all of this is Buckminster Farms, of which more later, that, you know, again, you know, and they are one of the big Leicestershire landowners over towards the Lincolnshire border, and they're getting something like £600,000 a year out of the Common Agricultural Policy. That the UK currently produces about 54% of its own food by value, and about 27% comes from the rest of the EU and about 19% from the rest of the world. So, in a sense, we're dependent on home production plus EU gets us 80% of the way there. But about 70% of the cropland used for UK is actually overseas, because it's used more extensively and crops are grown overseas at low value. I suppose particularly a lot of animal feed crops and so on, that are then imported into the UK, fed to UK sheep, cattle and chickens, and marketed in the UK with added value. And so what are we going to do about all of this as the Green Party, I suppose, is what we're trying to do with the policy. And I think there's probably kind of three main sets of policy options available to a political party without an armed wing. And that is, to use government and public power to encourage positive action or outcomes, and that's usually done through sort of, cajoling but subsidies, essentially. And so if somebody's going to kind of look after their soil or whatever, you pay them a premium and so on. To inhibit or prohibit negative actions through bans, regulations, licensing. In extreme cases, you can take on criminal sanctions to stop people doing things. And there's a sort of third line, which is sort of creating intermediary organisations, so setting up public advisory bodies, marketing boards, colleges that do training in particular ways of doing things, cooperatives between different farmers and producers, and so on, and research institutes. So there's a whole range of things that you can do. So, in a sense, if we became the government, or more likely, kind of linked up with another government, what would we as a party want to do with the resources that are available to kind of turn our food system around to where we want to get it to? And I suppose there's paying subsidies, and there's a whole range of different ways in which you can do that, and I've tried to kind of list some of those options. But I think paying for the amount of food produced, which used to be the old system, you just got paid per ton or whatever. Paying for kind of keeping the land in good condition, paying for using particular farming practices like going organic or what have you, payment for and basing it on kind of job creation and jobs per worker rather than land, because some of the kind of horticultural stuff, and we are very short of fruit and vegetables as a country, then uses actually more workers per hectare than big machine agriculture. I think payment per worker per job created, something like that you could have as a system. Incentives for younger people to enter farming, because as many people know, the average age of the UK farmer is about 57. And so there is a need to bring younger people in. And I think the other view, and certainly it's a view expressed very strongly by people like Colin Tudge and the Oxford Real Farming Conference people and so on, is that we need more smaller farmers running small mixed farms and the like, because per hectare they can be just as efficient as the big farms with mega machinery and all the rest of it. Per gallon of fuel put in, they're probably more efficient, but per worker, per pound, that sort of thing, they possibly don't come out so well. Payment for maintaining aspects of the environment, about forestry, hedgerows, clean water, and that kind of thing. Support for water management and what's come to be called ecosystem services, so that if you've got a river flowing through your land, and the river's kind of managed in such a way that if there's a flood coming, it goes on your pasture, then you get a bit of payment towards that, because actually it's cheaper for everybody and probably doesn't do the pasture any harm, rather than flooding the city just a few miles downstream, where you're bailing out houses and you've got huge bills to pay for repairs and stuff. Paying incentives for reducing carbon emissions. So those are some of the things you could, balances of the way in which you could use the money. And to what extent other things outside farming, about rural development and rural businesses and stuff. And the other thing is about establishing and maintaining the economic and ecological health of smaller farms, having a more vibrant food culture and farming community and stuff. I think prohibitions and controls, in a sense, sounds easier, but then having the kind of police or the monitoring system to put it in place is probably rather more difficult. But I think, across the Green Party, there's no great enthusiasm for GM crops, pesticide, insecticides, herbicides, and all the rest of it. And I think bans or strict licensing on much of that would be a kind of, I think, would pretty much consensus within the Green Party and so on. Soluble fertilisers is slightly, is another issue, because there's a lot of, that's what leaches into the watercourses and so on. Using antibiotics routinely for treating farm animals as growth promoters and so on. I think there's a whole load of kind of food safety and animal welfare regulations and stuff that need to be maintained or boosted. Looking at kind of restrictions on managing what you can and can't build on farming land and so on. And then we get into how you kind of regulate and develop and realign the whole food distribution system with reducing unnecessary packaging, food waste, the dominance of the supermarkets and what have you. And then there's a third bit, which is kind of other bodies and stuff, which I think we would want to be part of doing, which is shifting the balance of agricultural research from high-tech chemical-based GM type research into agroecological approaches and so on. And currently I think it's Switzerland, so I heard somebody quote the other day, has about 25% of its research money. Brief interruption. Pepperoni is for me, so don't worry about it. Just put it on the chair. That'll be fine.
Pop pepperoni over here.
Thank you. I'll come to that in a moment.
No problem. And your tricky for you?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Sorry about that.
So I think there's potential for thinking about establishing a range of different bodies of that kind. So that's what we've got to play for. And I think in terms of aims for the party's policy, we ought to be aiming for UK to grow as much of its own food as possible, using kind of ecological and sustainable farming methods, more smaller family farms, boost the fruit and veg growing sector, because at the moment the UK does import most of that, and I think, and that can be done both by commercial growing and in different ways, but also encouraging more people to have allotments and community supported agriculture and that kind of thing as part of it. And certainly moving towards less meat on ecological and environmental grounds. I think there are some, and I think it's probably an issue of live debate as to whether eating meat at all is a good thing, but then there are farmers who you talk to who say that actually it's partly having the livestock as part of the rotation that both helps soil fertility and also kind of encourages wildlife on the farm and so on. So I think that's I think based on fair trade internationally, reducing or eliminating artificial fertilisers and chemical insecticides and the like, moving towards local consumption and reducing food miles and consuming as much as possible as close to where it's produced, reducing the power of the big supermarkets, and a programme of engaging children, families and communities in understanding the food system. So that's where we're aiming, that's where I think we ought to be aiming for. And then there's various issues along the way. Something about scale, because I think many of the people around the party and that kind of thing, and there's people, and I was at the Oxford Real Farming Conference last week, are involved very actively in community horticulture schemes, in being small farmers, organic farmers, market gardens, that kind of thing. But actually, if we're going to have a policy that's going to work, then it's actually got to have some impact on the big scale, which is where I come back to Buckminster Farms. So my sort of little kind of test in kind of drafting some of this is, okay, so how would this impact on Buckminster Farms? With their sort of 10,000 acres or whatever it is stretching across East Leicestershire and their gargantuan machines and all that kind of thing. I think, where does meat fit into the kind of balance of policy aims and that kind of thing? For the reasons I've just mentioned. I think, how much do you want to invest in an infrastructure to monitor and regulate poor practice and support good practice and that kind of thing? Because, essentially that becomes kind of expanding the range of public servants and so on. So I think, how do you make sure that that kind of system adds value? And I think the other thing to think about is the impact on rural settlements, because one of the ways that agriculture and so on has changed over the past 30 years or so is that farms have got a lot bigger. A lot of the old kind of hereditary landlords have moved from renting out their farms on long-term tenancies to have been basically farming the land in hand. And they do that using farming contractors, which means that many of the people who work on the farms these days don't have permanent contracts. They come in and they do the ploughing for a fortnight and then they're gone, and somebody else will come and do the harvesting for a fortnight and what have you. And so there's nobody with a kind of commitment to and knowledge of the place. A lot of the old, and anybody who lives in villages will know this, that the farms that were located in villages, very often the farmhouses have been sold, the farm buildings have been converted into residential. So the infrastructure to re-establish kind of more family farms and stuff has largely gone, and so on. And so I think there's a whole load of stuff around the impact of all of this on rural infrastructure as well, which I think is relevant to a county like Leicestershire. So really, I was going to end by asking you all what you thought, and I don't know whether that was what you wanted, Darren.